This presentation will cover the mass memory of World War I through the medium of video games. Video games can be both entertaining and informative. Video games have become the biggest entertainment industry in the world, surpassing music and movies. Often these games are historical in nature. History games cover the expanse of human warfare and often ride the spectrum between historical accuracy and fantastic interpretation. Game developers also have to straddle the line between authenticity and fun gameplay. Often aspects of collective memory are lost and others shaped by what's included and what is not. Visuals, sounds, and emotions all play a role in how we relate to certain historical events. These games cover many genres, from first-person shooters and strategy to even flight simulators. World War I tends to get overshadowed by World War II, historically and gameplay-wise. However, with the centenary, there has been a rush of World War I games, mainly in three genres: strategy, first-person shooter, and the smallest, story-driven adventure. We'll look at each of these genres first by watching two trailers, and then discussing what the games add to and take away from the collective memory of the war. Not just in visual themes such as trenches and barbed wire, but deeper concepts such as violence, trauma, grief, bereavement, crusade, and mourning, all of which were integral to the conflict.
The beginning of 20th century. The war. Soldiers die fighting for the victory in race cities, in fortifications filled with dirt and toxic gases, on wire entanglements under machine gun fire. Thousands of human lives are pinned on victory's altar, theirs and ours lives. Technical progress has opened up new ways of rapid human extermination. Offensives in full uniform have been replaced by horrors of gas attacks and a bloody mess of trenches torn by shrapnel. The human life costs nothing anymore. Get ready, Commander. Challenging tasks are waiting for you. We believe in you. Your soldiers believe in you, and it's worth a lot. The value of a failure is too much high. Destiny of empires is at stake, and you get a chance to play an important role in this game. Remember this, and see you on the battlefield.
World War I is most often encountered in the strategy genre. Unlike other genres, some strategy games allow you to experience the lead up to the war, although usually on a limited scale, usually to get you right into the action. In strategy games, the player becomes an armchair general, and it often requires patience. There are varying degrees of accuracy. Sometimes there is alternate history. But strategy games provide a big picture, often sacrificing most aspects of trauma, grief, or bereavement. There is no dealing with the aftermath, win or lose a game. The violence is fairly hands off and clinical, often breaking down to simple numbers. Civilians and POW are non issue. There is no trauma, there are no shell shock soldiers to deal with after the fact. When a game is over, it is simply over, with very little emotional resonance lingering on. Typically, strategy games don't take moral sides in the conflicts, with each country simply being an interchangeable player across the whole. Varying level of gameplay mechanics that lend to realism can be found in strategy games. This includes resource management, logistics, technological limitations. While the grander scale is typically touched on, traditional trench warfare is often eschewed for greater entertainment appeal. And while strategy games can help a player understand the greater conflict of World War I, they often fall very short in understanding the great human cost.
First-person shooters. First-person shooter will be abbreviated to FPS from here on. FPSs have achieved moderate success within a dedicated player base, but very few featured a recognizable narrative or plot aside from the historical backdrop. That's from historian Chris Kempshall. And for scale, Battlefield 1 alone sold 15 million copies in the first year. Generally, first-person shooters are immersed in the immediacy of action and combat with little historic information. There's limited storytelling in single player with even less in multiplayer, which turns into a competitive shooting game with a World War I theme and is interchangeable with just about any other setting. For World War I gameplay, entertainment, combat is sped up and fluid, also called run and gun, which goes counter to the historically static trench warfare of the Western Front. The FPS genre displays fast-paced, intense violence and is the most visceral and brutal of the genres. Historical technical details are highlighted through locations and visually in weapons and uniforms, but there's little to no focus on grief, bereavement, trauma, POWs, civilians, mourning, or any aftermath of the war, or what led to the war. So what remains? What is left? It tends to be memories of the war through locations, trenches, barbed wire, violence, and death. But on a more positive note, memorialization took an active form online when some members in both Battlefield 1 and Verdun also marked the date of 11 November 1918, which was the armistice and the ending of the war. The players took action by seizing combat during online multiplayer matches and or by throwing snowballs at each other. This development suggests that these games can become part of a wider landscape and framework of memorialization. Also from historian Chris Kempshall. Pertaining to Battlefield 1, which will be abbreviated to BF1 from here on, journalist Wes Fenlon showed BF1 to the National World War I Museum's archivist Jonathan Casey a highlight reel of weapons and vehicles. I reiterate, the archivist Casey was shown a highlight reel of weapons and vehicles. According to Casey, most of BF1's guns look accurate to the real things, but the way we run and gun with them and jump off of blimps, not so much. Also from Casey, weapons design is quite realistic despite small things like the lug for a bayonet on a weapon that did not have one at the time, or an improper magazine for a later adaptation to the weapon. For example, say, in 1926 an adaptation happened to a weapon that you will find in the game. There is incorrect reload animations for weapons, which mostly consists of sped up animations for gameplay's sake. Uniforms are accurate, however, there are issues such as gloves on soldiers that would not have them, or say improper cuffs on a jacket. Combat is fast and fluid, once again called run and gun, which mimics the other FPS games. And arguably, the only accurate combat would potentially be in house-to-house combat. Guns jammed a lot in World War I, and there's no weapons jamming in any of these games. Again, historical accuracy leans towards weapons design, uniforms, and locations. The way we play the action is not even close to accurate combat, arguably outside of house-to-house combat. From historian Chris Kempshall, the portrayal of the First World War in these games is predominantly European and white. Players may choose from both Allied and Central Powers in multiplayer, however, there is no story from the Central Powers. The story is entirely from the Allied perspective.
The first time you see someone die, everything shuts down. You're left with thoughts that go round and round. Every man has his demons.
I did what any father would do, and I would make the same choices again.
I just did what we all did. I followed orders.
Lives shattered. Love lost. One day, a farmer. The next, a soldier. sent far from home and torn from their loved ones. These unexpected heroes are swept away into the great war that rages on, always hungry for more. War makes men mad. But humanity can shine from even the darkest hours. And those valiant hearts stand up, fighting for love, friendship, and honor. To the point of sacrificing everything, even their own life. Some made it. Some did not. These are their stories.
Finally, we look at story-driven games. Story-driven games are a rarity when it comes to World War I games, being largely driven in the last few years by the Centenary. Being the smallest genre, story-driven games are awfully visually distinct and allow for greater artistic expression, as you can see with our two examples, Valiant Hearts and Memories Retold, which present a comic and watercolor painting visual respectively. As opposed to the other two genres, story-driven places a greater emphasis on human cost, and is often based on real stories that occurred during the conflict. This allows both sides of the conflict to be explored. Gameplay mechanics, which are so central to the first two genres, are secondary to story and often feel tacked on. However, these story-driven games allow for a greater historical exploration and often a gateway into history. While accuracy is sometimes sacrificed in order to tell an entertaining story, many of the themes that are not explored in the other two genres are central here. Violence and trauma are visceral and in your face. Grief and bereavement are often key components to story-driven games, with an emotional connection being drawn during and in the aftermath of each game. Finally, several key components to the war, which are often glossed over by the other two genres, are fairly touched upon in story-driven games. These include POWs, the misery of the war, civilian casualties, and even executions by friendly armies. These often overlooked aspects of World War I can be found in literature, and sometimes in movies, but very rarely in World War I games. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, World War I is often overlooked by other more dynamic battlefields and time eras, such as World War II. World War I's static trench warfare does not lend to exciting storytelling or rapid-fire gameplay. However, with the centenary and a rush of World War I games, the mass memory of World War I has again been rekindled. While no particular genre excels at telling the totality of the story, across all three genres, much of the legacy of the First World War is touched upon, inviting a greater look, historically, into the conflict. However, with the end of the centenary, interest in the time period may wane, leaving the question of whether or not we will see any more World War I games in doubt.